China has announced a tit-for-tat sanctions on 4 U.S. and Canadian individuals and entities, this being the latest in a row over the alleged abuse to the country's Uyghur Muslim community. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says that this is a response to sanctions imposed on Chinese citizens and groups by the two countries earlier this week. China has also imposed retaliatory sanctions on more than a dozen European and British entities and individuals. Western governments have accused China of violating the rights of the Uyghurs in camps in Xinjiang region, saying that they're subject to forced labor. China has accused them of spreading lies and disinformation. Beijing says its camps in the region offer vocational training. And joining us now for this news review program is Jason Unruhe, political commentator out of Ontario, Canada, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Hello, gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you both to the broadcast here. Tony, we're going to start with you. Your latest on the story. Okay, obviously we don't have Tony up and going yet. So, Jason, we're going to start with you, get your initial thoughts on this spat over the Uyghur Muslim community. It's been something that's been on the spotlight, not recently, for a while now, but now it's things are getting turned up ratchet-wise, and with respect to tensions between the West and Beijing. Why?
Well, there is a competition between the United States and China for who is going to be the superpower essentially going into this new century. It seems that so far there's been a great struggle between the two. It's very obvious to basically all the powers around the world that the United States is on a very serious decline and China is on a very serious rise. Now, normally these things in the repeated pattern of world wars back in the 19th century, these would end in world wars. But obviously, in the age of the atom, this is a much more difficult proposition. It's more of a case of nobody's going to win those kinds of wars. So thus they must resort to much more political and economic means of undermining each other. Essentially, China doesn't really have to carry out any aggressions against the United States because it's already rising. So the U.S. is trying to undermine China, and then China is responding in kind. This accusation of forced labor camps and a Uyghur genocide are wholly without merit. I mean, the U.S. State Department has already admitted they have no evidence of a Uyghur genocide whatsoever. And this is from the U.S. State Department's lawyers themselves admitting that essentially there's no evidence for this accusation. And as a result, the U.S. is continuing to use these accusations as a justification for continuing to place pressure on the Chinese economy in order to hinder and undermine its growth, keeping in mind that this also occurs at the same time when China is reaching out to many other countries that are victims of U.S. imperialism that have been under the jackboot of it for some time, since the U.S. has ruled for several decades in a unipolar world. So given all of this, we understand why the United States is now carrying out this renewal of hostilities politically and economically against China.
Thank you, Jason. And Tony, I'd like to welcome you to the program. Now, Tony, from your perspective, why is Beijing being targeted on so many fronts by the West these days?
Well, I think we've got to look at what's at the heart of this conflict. It is, I believe, that the United States and the West generally has given up on trying to compete with China in trade. So they're trying to use all sorts of other ways to get to China because they can't compete with them on a level playing field fairly when it comes to trade. So this has triggered a whole load of other incidents, the main one of which is the arrest of the Huawei chief financial officer Meng Wanzhou about 3 years ago now in Canada, which has triggered off a whole load of tit-for-tat events, mainly to do with sanctions and sanctions on specific individuals, expulsions of journalists, expulsions of diplomats. But at the heart of this latest is these accusations over the Uyghurs in the west of China. Now, people forget that this region of China was actually only taken over relatively recently by Beijing, that they're actually a Turkic people. They're not naturally associating eastwards with Beijing. They're more associating westwards with Istanbul and other Turkic peoples to the west. So there's a problem there. that needs to be addressed. And also there's a spiritual one which will involve and interest many Muslims and other people of faith around the world, in that China does deny any kind of actual real faith in God. That's part of the Chinese philosophy. What they expect Chinese citizens to do is to believe in President Xi. Now, I'm not saying that he's a bad guy, but it's a little bit like having a pope running the country, where you've got to believe in President Xi. And if you don't, you can actually be guilty of a criminal offence if you do things like laugh at the flag, as many of us do quite regularly here in Britain, I can assure you, at our own flag. You can be arrested for that in China too. So there's a torn loyalties for the whole of the Uyghur region and the Muslims living there, that they are, on the one hand, are being told in the legal system that they must be loyal to President Xi, but of course most of them in their heart of hearts are loyal to Allah and to the Quran. And so that's why I think we need to understand exactly what's going on in these camps. Some say re-education, some say punishment for not believing in President Xi. So I wouldn't dismiss out of hand that there is mistreatment of these Muslims going on in Xinjiang. All I'd say is I think the West has been exaggerating it for its own political ends.
Right, and that's the thing. Speaking of exaggeration, Jason, because there are Muslims like perhaps Shia Muslims in Bahrain or Saudi Arabia that are getting a lot worse treatment, even the United Arab Emirates, than being totally marginalized. You don't hear anything out of Washington. So why this fight, this particular fight with Beijing? A lot of critics feel like because of the threat that Tony alluded to, and you also alluded to, that perhaps really Washington doesn't want to see Beijing grow anymore and wants to get it under its own control, and it's going to use its allies to do that.
I think that is the case. If the United States actually cared about Muslims or the rights of Muslims around the world, they wouldn't have killed 3 million of them by bombing Afghanistan and Iraq. So this idea that somehow the U.S. is a champion of religious or ethnic rights around the world is just simply facetious. This is all about politically undermining China in a way that would justify economic sanctions, etc., against the country. So I think that a lot of this really is wholly without merit and is merely a power play by the United States. There doesn't seem to be any real concern for the Uyghur people. As we previously saw, the Nike Corporation claimed that there was forced labor, so they decided that they were going to fire all of their Uyghur employees and refuse to hire any more Uyghurs over allegations of slave labor. Well, if it was slave labor, how did they hire them to begin with? Because they would have been under detention by the Chinese government if that were the case. So it doesn't really make any sense. And one could accuse Nike of trying to specifically foment unemployment and thus social unrest inside the Uyghur region. So it is very large and very complicated. But it definitely, the U.S. cannot claim to be the champion of human rights of anyone.
Thank you, Jay and Tony. Your final thoughts, please.
Well, I just have to say I think that he's right in many ways. I don't believe that the Uyghurs are being given, neither are Christians and Jews, given proper rights in China. And that is because of their communist philosophy discounts the idea of God. And I think we must understand that that is a very important idea. And the supremacy of President Xi, I think it's not appropriate to have this kind of absolute unswerving total belief in a political leader. We also need freedom of spiritual thought. But let's remember that the United States is providing through its satellite companies, at least it was until within the last couple of months, assistance to the Chinese government from its surveillance satellites. So passing information from those, actually not just passing, selling the use of those surveillance satellites to the Chinese authorities so they can follow their citizens around and help catalogue them, profile them like cattle. So if the United States really cared about the Chinese people, they could help them all by switching off those satellites.
Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us on the program. Always a pleasure to have you both check in. Jason Unruhe, political commentator there, joining us out of Ontario, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Stay safe till we see both of you again. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's news review program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.